Welcome to the Arena Decklist Podcast. I'm Jerry Thompson, joined as always by Brian Gottlieb, and I guess we're going to talk about Standard. There's some interesting things, I shall say, happening in older formats, but Standard still seems the most relevant, yeah?
Yeah, it's hard because I think the player base is very fractured right now. And I know a lot of our listeners do love when we do modern episodes, pioneer episodes. And I've heard from a lot of people who are like, well, I'm not listening as much because you guys aren't doing those episodes. And I get that. If that's your thing, that's fine. But a lot of people just can't play those formats right now. There's not a huge install base on Magic Online. I kind of feel like it's the same people playing these challenges every single week.
They're all bots, actually.
Yeah, it's all AIs at this point, just battling against each other. But we love those formats. We'll touch on them, but we have to go with what the broadest percentage of our listener base is currently playing, and I think that remains Standard for the time being.
You know what would be nice is if there was like a reason to play Historic right now.
That would be swell, and I think Historic's probably pretty interesting, but there's not one. I mean, like, there was a chance the SCG Tour would go with that for their formats, because they left their formats unannounced. I think wisely so they could really, get a sense of how Standard was going, given how rocky Standard has been.
True. Good idea.
Yeah, but it's been good. And I think they made the correct call to stay with Standard, because you want as many engaged possible players as you can get, just like we want as many engaged listeners as we can possibly get. So that leads us to Standard for the time being.
How do we get everyone on the same page?
If only there was some way we could organize the play so it was going in a particular direction, then I think we could achieve that goal.
Wait, are you trying to walk back the sealed episode, or are you saying it was not worth it for us to do that?
Well, from a listenership perspective, it probably was not worth it. From a happiness perspective, I think it was 100% worth it, because I heard from a lot of people who were like, this really helped me. I found this very useful. So if one person reached out with those sentiments, I would be happy to do that episode.
I heard from like twos of people.
There you go. Two people.
The episode, so. Totally
worth it. Seriously, that's all I need. Like if somebody is particularly happy with something we do, then that's enough to keep me going.
Yeah, fair enough. Man, so last weekend there was the MPL and Rivals Kaldheim League weekend thing. There was also a PTQ thing on Arena. And
don't even try and get the names right anymore. Just call them what you want.
The thing with the stuff, with the business,
right?
The delis and the happenings. Yeah. I watched a lot of the league weekend stuff, and it was okay. It was just like a lot of stuff that I had kind of already seen play out or had played out myself, so it wasn't super interesting. There wasn't a ton of innovation. There were a couple exceptions to that where it's like, innovation plus actually being good. So that's always nice to see. But yeah, for the most part, it was a lot of the same decks just kind of jamming into each other.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes down to the incentives present. Like a horrific performance can possibly doom your entire Magic career. Whereas if you can put together a solid performance and fall in the middle of the pack, that's fine. And you can keep going and keep your job. So there's a lot of really perverse incentives with the way the league play is set up that I do think discourages real dramatic risk taking.
Man, when you put it like, you have a bad weekend, you lose your job, that's pretty brutal,
It is pretty brutal. And there are a lot of players expressing that they're a little worn down by the league weekends. And that was tough to see, because I'm thinking back to my experience competing in the limited pro tours I did play, but it never felt like a drag. I was pumped to show up at every pro tour, and it was something special. And granted, this isn't like a pro tour, but this is supposed to be like a hallmark event for Magic organized play. And it having such a negative effect on its participants it was tough to swallow. And I think if you're these are the most enfranchised players in the world, nobody should care about Magic more than they do. And if they're like, yeah, I'm not really loving this right now, you should listen to them. You should understand where things are going wrong. And I think a lot of it is the incentives. A lot of it is being forced to play from home. I'll say that. I don't think that's the optimal way to build a league, but that's always what this league was going to be. That's not a COVID concession, I don't believe. I think we're always supposed to do it like this. So
yeah, no, I mean, that's That's how it was even in the initial year, was
Right.
that you play your matches from home, and obviously that creates a lot of awkwardness where I don't know. It's at some point I think in the wrap up article, the highlights article, they talk about how ha ha ha, like Li Shiqian always has to play in the middle of the night. Isn't that funny? And it's like,
No, not funny.
no,
That's
it's not.
brutal.
It's messed up.
Yeah. And granted, like you would face that kind of stuff on the Pro Tour, where depending on where the Pro Tour was, some people would certainly be geographically favored because they didn't have to deal with jet lag or, a brutal travel schedule, but it got distributed over time. And I'm not going to say it was even. It certainly favored American players, but at least there was some like back and forth where we were traveling to different time zones and in Europe or in Asia, and everyone got a chance to be on the good side of the equation.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's pretty awkward. I want them to have weekends like this, but have them just be like, 4 a year, 3 a year, something like that, and just have them be like mini worlds tournaments that
Yep.
also work towards your
Yep.
standing,
It should be a small tournament. That's how you break this and make it interesting again. Is it's just like
Right.
little small tournaments. This league play does not engage me. It does not spark my interest. The players don't love it either. So who's it really for at this point? And the viewership is not outstanding or anything. It's passable for sure, but small tournament seems so much better. And you can assign points in the same way. Like there's no reason not to, I get there's more variance inherent in that way, but like just smooth out some of the ups and downs of the players club system, and then you can bear variance, because the old system had a ton of variance, but like you only had to hit a certain threshold, and the whole thing needs to be reexamined. And we've talked about it ad nauseum at this point, so I'll try not to go into it again. But every single time it rears its head, I'm just like, man, I want so much better for everyone involved with the game right now.
Yeah, it's also just like really hard to care about a match where it's someone who's like 5-1 playing against someone who's 1-5 or whatever.
Sure.
Just like it's all very like skewed and kind of messed up. And granted, I don't think they're showing a lot of those matches, but
the bad weekend problem too. It's like, how could you not feel for Martin after this weekend, where he just has to sit there and just get pummeled round after round after round? And I'm like, trust me, I'm not dragging Martin whatsoever. One of the best players in the history of the game, but like everyone has bad tournaments, bad weekends, and his was never ending. It just went on and on and on. What a brutal experience.
yeah, I would have just stopped playing.
Right.
I would have dropped.
I don't know. I can't imagine having to go through that.
Yeah. I mean, certainly can't be good. And I don't know, you're like 0-10 on the weekend playing that 11th match, and it's just got to be like, man, get me the hell out of here,
Yeah. I can't imagine.
So these deck lists were submitted a little bit early. I don't know if it was like the Monday before the tournament or whatever. That's around when I would guess. And the new thing, I guess, to come out of this is the Naya Fury deck, which we talked about last week. And when they submitted their decks, it was like, still relatively fresh and new, right?
Right.
The list that people submitted definitely looked like they were just like hot off the press. Not a ton of innovation was spread throughout those, which is fine. There were some lists like Sultai, the Czech Houses version of Sultai looked good. It looked like a good version of that deck, at least for like this metagame. And everything else was kind of normal. A lot of mono white, a lot of mono red, a lot of different adventure decks, and then people trying to do cool stuff and mostly failing.
Yeah, I think if there is a breakout story, it's not actually the progression of the Naya Adventures deck, it's the regression of it. Because if you break down the results between Naya Fury and Naya Adventures, lacking Fury, and that's something played by like Reed Duke, William Jensen, Ely Cassis, all played a deck that looks older in a lot of ways. It just doesn't have that package, but they outperformed the Fury deck by a pretty large margin. I think they had the best performing deck on the weekend, and it's just a very classical take on Naya Adventures, leveraging these incredible sources of card advantage. And one of the things I posited is, why do you make this decision? Why do you regress when there is this hot new technology? And in my head, it's when you say, I know how to answer everything in the format. Like if I get enough cards, I will play my way out of any situation. And this color combination has the tools to do whatever I need to do, given I just establish this great henge, and then it'll snowball out of control. And I think that checks out given how this deck is built. Like you look at the odd inclusions, Max Giant Killer, Random Yasharn, 3 Scavenging Ooze, which is a card that has very much fallen out of favor. Main deck Maxed Vandal, and some Fire Prophecies. So unique inclusions, but I think if you've played any games with this deck, and I have, I kind of wanted to feel, what's the difference here? Why is there something that looks like a regression on its face, but turned out to be the correct call? And it just felt like you could play out of any game, and you put this deck in the hands of some extremely talented players, and you end up with the type of results that they posted on the weekend.
So do you know what the number for the Fury decks was? Because I'm curious about that.
I saw a breakdown somewhere. It may have been Tristan from our Discord who broke it down by Fury and Adventures. But I remember, and this isn't exact, this is just going off my memory, Fury did fine. It was like a 52, 53% win rate or something like that.
Okay.
But the version broken down to like Naya Adventures was like 58, 59% or something like that. So, small sample size, certainly in range of being similar, but playing this deck, it did feel like, okay, this was a wise choice for the weekend. And I think it's about the metagame finally settling down. I think the targets were very clear going into this weekend, and this deck reflected that.
Yeah, the Wizards page has Naya Adventures, both Fury and the more classical one lumped together, and it's a 57% win rate. And I imagined that, given that Reed and them had such good records, they were carrying that by a lot. So I didn't know if Naya Fury was above or below 50%.
Yeah, like I said, I don't have it in front of me, and I don't remember where I saw it, so I can't reference it. But I remember it being fine. Not spectacular, but fine.
Right, yeah. So the thing that I'm skeptical of with the regressive Naya deck is that I certainly want to build my decks in that way, right? Like bunch of great henges, screw Embercleave. I'm just going to try and do this thing. Is that there's like Emergent Ultimatum and All Runs Epiphany and even like the cycling decks, right? Where a lot of the decks that exist in the format can actually go over the top of you. And there are matchups, like mono red, mono white. Like obviously you'd much rather have a great henge than an Embercleave for a lot of different reasons in like the vast majority of scenarios, right? So I get it. I'm just scared of like the other part of the metagame, and I don't really see a lot of good ways to address that in Naya.
I think it's part metagame call, where you expect this to be the week that the Sultai decks start to tail off. And that mostly played out. Only 6 copies of Sultai across the 2 league play weekends. And that was like the 5th most played deck.
It was just the one team though, too.
Right. So if that team doesn't reach the conclusion of we want to play this deck, the deck is just gone from the metagame, right? And you kind of get why it wasn't having a lot of success on the SCG tour. And you mentioned they did a good job of rebuilding the deck, making a good version of it. So you understand why they were able to put up a pretty good record. It says on the Wizards site, 54.5% win rate. So, nothing to scoff at, to be sure. But I think there was room for there to just be almost no Sultai. And also the sideboard of this deck is very cognizant of the things it's going to be facing. And I think you shift a little bit at that point and look to control those games. Then you're still a dog, I think, to something like Sultai. But I think you're just saying, okay, we don't believe this deck is all that good anymore. We expect fewer people to play it. And you have a puncher's chance when you're set up like this. Like sometimes you just make a bunch of Bone Crusher Giants and Kazandu Mammoths and you run over your opponent and you beat them. And it's not what you want to bank on, but it can pull you out of some really tough situations. Or you just get wide enough where like they do their thing and you can still beat them despite that, which I think this deck is also very good at doing.
Yeah, so this Naya deck very much looks like it was meant to beat up on creature decks and other adventures decks. And I think it does a really good job of that.
Yeah, one of the things about Giant Killer is that it was particularly well positioned for this weekend. It not only challenged the Goldspan Dragons of the opposing Naya decks, and obviously, there's ways to play around that. There's like Sajiri Shelter, which can sometimes still protect it, but you can't just let them do their thing. And I think Giant Killer was perfect for that. But also like being able to get Vorinclex, I got it right on the first pass.
Nice.
At first shot with Giant Killer when it comes into play, that's usually enough to get you the time you need to like be able to wither the beating that they're about to put on you and find lethal on the next turn. So I like it in that matchup as well.
So I'm worried about the scenarios where they basically like kill all of your stuff, strand your great henges, and then just win at their leisure. You know, I'm not worried about you have 4 creatures and they're like desperation ultimatuming. But even then, there are scenarios where, you know, they get Shadow's Verdict, Time Walk, X. Maybe X is like Kira Best of Sea Gods or something, right? And then you're in a bad situation.
Yeah, I'm not trying to argue. It's like, it's good and you're fine and you don't have to worry about it. I'm very sure the matchup swings in Sultai's favor with this setup. I just think like it was a calculated decision and one that paid off.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I wasn't really impressed with the Fury decks. Like, I was expecting to be kind of impressed, and I think that it's certainly something that is better when your opponent doesn't know what's going on with your deck and certainly doesn't have like a week or two to prepare for it and like test against it and stuff, right?
Sure. So, yeah, I think that's always true of like the split plan decks, right? When you get any surprise equity from a deck like that, it's so huge.
And at the time, Naya Adventures was pretty normal. And I think even in the case of like the Sultai matchup, right? It's like, okay, they have a Goldspan Dragon, but I don't need to deal with that like immediately. You know, I can spend my turn maybe like preparing to ultimatum next turn or whatever, and then you just get combo killed. That basically just doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think it was a good adaptation from the field. And that's always going to be what happens when you have really good players going at it. So not surprised, but it still seems like the fail states on these decks are so good, right? That's the thing about Edgewall Innkeepers is you just don't fail all that often. Like you always have a fine game plan, even when people are prepared. So, and I think that's going to be true throughout Edgewall Innkeeper's life. You just can't hold this card down.
No, of course. Kind of wish that it got the axe instead of Clover, but whatever.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would have just taken both out. I think like
that too.
In a block with so many mistakes, you give Adventures a pass, but Adventures are just 2 Magic cards in one, and like I don't know how regular Magic cards you're supposed to stand up in the face of that, and then you give him this ridiculous draw engine on top of it. It's out there, man.
Right. I mean, Bone Crusher, Lovestruck Beast, in this case, Giant Killer too. It's like we'd be playing these cards anyway. You don't need to give us Innkeeper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Going forward, I don't think that there's a whole lot of reason to play the Fury version unless the metagame changes significantly.
I agree with you. I said in my article, I think this is the way forward for Naya for at least the short term, and nothing stays static in this metagame. It's a good metagame. It rotates a lot. There's small moves to make, big moves to make, and it's been exciting and cool to see throughout. But at this moment, this is the version of Naya I would play. I expect something to rise up to punish this, just like everything else has been punished in this format. It's pretty good at cycling through all the options.
So the deck that maybe had the best win rate, again, I'm not sure like what Reed's Naya list, their record with it was, but Teamer Adventures had a 65% win rate, although even, you know, smaller sample size than a lot of the other decks here. Like there are only 5 players playing it.
Yeah, and I think that was mostly in the Rivals League, if I recall correctly. And I'm doing a quick scroll through now. I think only 1 player in the MPL chose to play the Teamer Adventures list. And that's an interesting distinction. I mean, I don't really know what to make of it, but it's a data point worth considering.
Yeah, it is weird. I don't know why this deck has been so underrated. I wrote about it this week and, you know, brought that up a little bit. It's like not really worth harping on or anything, but I think that this deck does a lot of the things that the Naya deck is trying to do, where, you know, you're a little weak to like Goldspan Dragon combos, or at the very least, like, you know that players are going to play the Naya deck, so you need some way to interact with it. So you go to Giant Killer, and Giant Killer's just kind of good across the board. And Teamer solves that issue, you know, maybe not as well, but like with Brazen Borrower and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then you have things like Alrund's Epiphany that just gives you an edge against decks like Naya, especially where they don't have counterspells to actually interact with it. You know, you're just free to cast your big spell and know that it's going to happen. And then against Sultai and things like that, you just have a bunch of counterspells. So this deck is awesome.
I agree with you. And I think there's a lot of other stuff that I saw people trying to do in some of the more fringe deck lists. And I just think this is a better way of doing it. In particular, like there's a Sultai Rogues list that I want to talk about in a little bit that didn't really have a great weekend, but interesting idea. But
is my boy Riser, man.
Yeah.
I saw. I think his was the first match that I tuned into, and I just saw the deck list. I'm like, Riser, no, what are you doing?
I didn't know if you were going to defend your boy here. I didn't love the deck list. I get the theory behind it, but I just think you can do it better with Teamer Adventures.
I think it's the worst Riser deck I've ever seen.
Okay.
And
now that's not so bad, right? Like there's a lot of room to be the worst Riser deck and still be interesting and like pretty unique.
Yeah. He's like kind of hit or miss, but he takes a lot of shots, right? And I really respect that. But this is just one of those things where it's like, I don't even really see what you're going for, you know? And won like a third of his matches, so kind of got beat up.
Yeah, tough weekend. I think the idea is just like shore up some of the weaknesses of Rogues just by the addition of Lovestruck Beast. And I get it. I mean, I think Lovestruck Beast is the best card in Standard, or the most important is often how I phrase that. So I think it's the most important card in Standard. But if you're playing it, you can do better.
I think BBD did a better job of that with his list, just playing like Deadweight's main deck and stuff.
Okay, yeah, there's ways to do it within color,
or maybe they weren't. Maybe they weren't main deck. Maybe they were sideboard, but still.
My theory is is that Rogues is more of like a metagame call, and if you have to warp Rogues that dramatically, you're just not supposed to be playing it.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. I do think that now, especially, there are different ways to build it, and we talked about that a little bit when we went through the challenges, right?
Yep.
Where there's like an interesting one that didn't have into the story, and it's like, okay, that's reasonable. I could see how that would be viable. And now there are things like Season Hallowblade that you certainly have to address, and now you're starting to see like Deadweights pop up, which is good. It combos with Luris anyway. I think that there are different ways to go about it, but yeah, I mean, if at the end of the day you're like, I have to play like 20 cards that I wouldn't normally play just to get this matchup to be palatable, it's like, oh, go play something else. There's plenty of options.
Yeah, plenty of good options right now. I think that's the way I would approach it.
All right, so Teamer. Tell me all the things that you know about Teamer. Sell people on Teamer, because I could talk about this deck for an hour probably.
Yeah, I just think like it's so important to close games, and the addition of Alrund's Epiphany does that so effectively, especially like, look, I build a lot of Alrund's Epiphany decks, and I mostly build them to be quasi-competitive, I would say. Like I'm interested in the idea, so I'm trying to see other ways to do it. But the best version of an Alrund's Epiphany deck is always going to be one that can make a large battlefield and leverage an additional attack from Alrund's Epiphany and just win the game on the spot. And I've built a lot of control decks featuring Alrund's Epiphany that like benefit from sagas that I think are pretty good, and Toski decks that are like small ball and you're supposed to chain into additional epiphanies, and all that stuff is good. Alrund's Epiphany is a very strong magic card, and there's a lot of ways to make it work. But I think ultimately the best way to make it work is just, I have this serious battlefield presence. I can do you chunks of damage. I even have a mana engine in the form of Goldspan Dragon, so I'm able to accelerate to this card a little bit. And if you give me a window, I will just kill you. That's it. You're not going to get chances to do ultimatum nonsense or set up your combo until it's completely safe, until I have to put my shields down, because I'm always going to have my Saw It Coming mana open. You have to think about that. I have the potential to punish you at instant speed, and Brazen Borrower as well. So there's plenty of play. And you're just not going to get the clean window to do the things you want to do. And if you give them too much time, they will Epiphany you. And against decks that don't have counter magic, Epiphany feels so... It's just like there's no risk. There's no fear when you jam your Epiphany. You get paid so hard every time.
The worst that they can do is like, oh, maybe they kill one of your creatures,
right,
or whatever. But
great, okay. I picked up 2 more. I'll live with it.
Yep. Like I said, I like this deck a lot. Epiphany versus like Great Henge out of Naya. I'm pretty sure Epiphany wins in a lot of those scenarios.
I wouldn't downplay the ability to get into the air with this setup, right? Like being able to get wide in the air with Brazen Borrower, the Epiphany Birds, and some Goldspan Dragons. Like a lot of battlefields get bogged down. And especially when the Great Henge gets involved, you can often end up with just 2 battlefields staring at each other because all the creatures are oversized. There's really no window to go through. But the flash and Brazen Borrow at the end of your turn, and then make my Alrund's Epiphany and just dome you for a large amount of damage out of nowhere. It's so satisfying. And you're just, taking 13 damage that you weren't expecting to take in a 1-turn window. And that's not something you can really play around.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that your last Epiphany is also going to lead into Obosh too.
Right. Good point. Yeah.
So I get why this is an Obosh deck. I think Obosh makes sense here. For the most part, I think that Obosh post rules change is just not great in general, but Epiphany just curves so well into it.
Yeah.
Right. So, and also there's Goldspan Dragon, which can make it seem kind of trivial to actually get it out there. And you're not giving up a lot, but there are some things that became like more apparent this weekend where it was like, oh, like Obosh is like really hampering your card choices in a lot of scenarios. And like Naya is one of them where you have like Saw It Coming and Mystical Dispute as your counter magic. And both are a little bit awkward, a little bit clunky. And then there was the cycling matchup, which only 2 players played it, but this was the second best performing deck, I think. It was like 62%.
Yeah, well, there's 4-color cycling and Jeskai cycling.
Oh, okay.
So there's a break between the two.
Yeah,
but both did well though.
So 4-color cycling, 61%, Jeskai 52%, which is not anything to get super excited about, but it's still solid, right?
I think now you're looking at a few weeks of very good performances from this deck where it's less like, oh, here's a breakout performance, and more, here's a body of work that has been put together that says this is a real deck. And nobody really accounts for it in any planning sideboard guides. It's just like, oh, yeah, cycling's out there, but it doesn't get the probably respect it deserves at this point.
Yeah, you see the occasional like Tormod's Crypt in
Soul Guide Lantern.
Yeah, Autumn Burchett is really good at this, where I notice like her sideboards, I'm just like, why is that there? Oh yeah, cycling, like I guess that's a thing, but like, Autumn is prepared for it because she knows that it's a good deck, right?
Right.
And just, not a lot of people end up playing it, but it had a pretty good weekend. And, there are 2 distinctions, right? Like 4-color and Jeskai. And like Kowalski's deck was a little more out there, where he had Ironcrag Pyromancer and Teferi, the 4-mana Teferi, Master of Time.
Yep.
And stuff like that. And Improbable Alliance, I always mess that up.
Improbable, right?
It's improbable, yeah. But I always call it
actually
Indomitable.
Know one. Good.
That card is like creeping up more and more into main decks, and it's a huge problem for decks that are not playing Embercleave. And that definitely happened to I think it was Chris Patello. It was definitely like that matchup where it was Teamer against cycling, and it was just the fairies held them off. Maybe it wasn't Chris. Maybe it was someone playing Naya. I think that's what it was.
Okay.
Whereas like the fairies against Goldspan Dragon and like trying to get it through, and it was like actually really hard.
Yeah, I think that's a real card. It's one that we were very interested in early on. I mean, all this like draw 2 stuff, Ironcrag, Pyromancer. I remember spending a lot of time on these decks and just coming out dissatisfied in the
Great
end.
Deck for 2008.
Right. But the whole cycling Zenith Flare thing doesn't feel like 2008 stuff. Like that feels like silly modern Magic. Like, well, okay, I'm going to back that up. It actually does feel like 2008 Magic, but like a Dredge deck where it's just not doing typical Magic, and you are still allowed to play a game that makes no sense under the conventional rules of Magic, but for some reason is allowed to exist. It's odd in the way decks used to be odd, I would say.
Yeah. And we don't see a lot of weird sideways stuff like that anymore.
Right. So I'm happy that this deck is part of the metagame. I think it's like, it's not the most fun to play with or against, but like it's good that there's curveballs and changeups and weird things happening from time to time.
Well, now that we have all the weird mana bases and you can do a bunch of wild stuff with the deck, I'm more inclined to actually try it before than when it was just a Boros deck.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I'm interested.
You're certainly getting access to a lot more games. Like there's many more things you can do when your mana is stable and across 3 or 4 colors. So
yeah, you saw that with Kowalski's deck. And I don't know if his take was great. It's certainly more clunky, but it's got more of like a mid to late game push than the normal lists. But I don't know if that's necessarily what you want versus just being as lean as possible and capping out at Zenith Flare. And now you have this Bitter Blossom that is able to buy you a bunch of time that your other cards couldn't really accomplish. But in the case of like the teamer matchup versus cycling specifically, if cycling is going to get more popular, Obosh might have to go. And that's kind of what I was talking about in my article this week, where it's like the best card in the matchup is probably just Embercleave, but it also opens the door to a bunch of other stuff where it's like if you want to play Scavenging Ooze or Tormod's Crypt or whatever, you could. And then Disdainful Stroke is just the best counter against Naya because it tags Dragon and their card drawing stuff, or Embercleave if they're doing that. So I actually like no Obosh right now, given what happened this weekend. But I mean, if those decks refuse to pick up, then yeah, keep playing Obosh because it's actually good in this deck.
Do you think you can? I mean, if you were just solely focused on, I need to make this cycling matchup positive, can you just dump a bunch of Soul Guide Lanterns into the problem and live on that and be satisfied that you're giving up a bunch of sideboard spots, or you need to do more?
No, well, so it's tough because Soul Guide Lantern solves one of the problems, but also in like a pretty bad way, where it counters a Zenith Flare, but depending on like what part of the game it's happening in, they can pretty easily just rebuild and flare you again. Mm-hmm. So you need like Graveyard Hate plus a clock to not have flare matter, but the problem is like they have Flourishing Fox on turn one that you have to kill. Sometimes Drannith Stinger you have to kill because you got nickel and dimed out by fairies or something. They have Improbable Alliance that you have to attack through, and it's just too much stuff, especially, you know, you're talking about Soul Guide Lantern or Clothis or whatever, and it's just like that just doesn't solve one of the 5 ways that they're attacking you.
Right. Yeah, the deck has diversified pretty dramatically at this point.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just really difficult. I think the best way to go about it is Graveyard Hate plus clock, but in order for clock to matter, you need to be able to get through those fairies, and Embercleave is the best way to do it because Embercleave will beat like, you know, 4 to 6 fairies or whatever, whereas a lot of the options, things like Shadow Spear or whatever, just don't really do that. It's like, all right, well then they finally just quad block and keep on living their life, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other like strange ways you could go to control that aspect of their game plan, and not coming up with anything off the top of my head.
Yeah, I was looking for like Cloud Thresher type of stuff. There's a bunch of different Pyroclasms, but that obviously doesn't interact all that well. Chris was talking on Twitter about, I think Garrick's Uprising is the name of the card. It's like 3-mana enchantment. Your stuff has trample. And then if you have big creatures, you draw some cards or whatever. But like not dealing the extra damage and not getting you over a bunch of fairies still. Like it's good when you have Lovestruck Beast against one fairy, right? But like when they have a bunch and a bunch of different blockers, then it still doesn't matter. Yeah,
I think you really want something like Karvek. How do you pronounce that card? I have no idea. I may as well straighten it out now.
So since I was like 6 or whatever, I pronounced it Karvek, but I don't know.
Okay. I would have said Karvek. I'm almost certain that's not correct based on the letters that actually appear in the name of the card. But yeah, that persistent -1/-1 effect is really what I'm looking for, but obviously not in the colors of Teamer.
Yeah, that card would be nice, or something like it. That was basically what I wanted, what I was looking for.
Yeah,
and then that would help a lot because it takes
Flourishing
out the
Fox.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you have Karvek and they're about to cast a 1/1 Fox or whatever, like they're just going to cycle it even if you don't have Karvek.
Fair enough.
It's not going to matter at that point. But like the Valiant Rescuer or whatever, the 3/1 that makes tokens too, all that stuff. So
yeah, it picks off a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that'd be pretty nice. Too bad black is reserved mostly for just like spot removal and sweepers in this metagame. So like decks that could play Karvek don't necessarily care about Alliance anyway.
Yeah, I wonder if there's space for it in like the Ultimatum deck. I could see it being a fine sideboard option.
Yeah, but you don't care, right? Like you're just sweep the board with Shadow's Verdict, and that buys you a couple turns, and then you just build towards something bigger.
Well, but they shift in post board games, right? Like they take on kind of the fish style role, so it's harder for you to do the big thing.
Sure. No, that's fair. I mean, so that's part of the problem too with the Teamer matchup is that Epiphany is no longer a slam dunk against them because they get some amount of disputes or strokes or whatever against you.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really important part of their game plan, and one that gets overlooked when people are evaluating this deck is just like there's not really anything else in the format that goes fish on you. Like Teamer kind of does it, but they still have these huge spells and they need to tap out and they need to pick their spots for their counter magic. They can't just, go after you with 1 mana creatures and then cycle and make them a threat as the game goes on. So it's a very different play pattern that this deck has access to.
Yeah, but the cycling deck can actually just become like a Delver deck in post-board games if it wants to, and feel pretty similarly to that.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of its appeal that gets overlooked.
Yeah, so like all of these things together and the fact that it has good mana now, I'm just like, okay, that's something I'm interested in. I'm on board with this now.
Yeah, I would say it's time to like reevaluate your biases against this deck because it's solid. It has a lot of game plans.
Is it like kind of boring? Do you spend a lot of turns just like, cycling your cards or whatever? Yeah, but you have really interesting deck building decisions and play decisions where basically like, every turn cycle or every turn or, even like a single action from either player can cause you to have to switch game plans. And then there's the sideboarding stuff where I'm sure you do a lot of stuff differently, like play and draw and with what like the texture of your hand is and stuff like that. Like you do make a lot of decisions. So
the more we talk about this deck, the more I'm pleased with the Dredge analogy because like, if you're just a casual observer, and I'm talking like older versions of Dredge that would just like LED Flamekin Zealot you on turn 1. And I played a ton of Legacy Dredge. It was one of my favorite Legacy decks. And on its surface, it's just like stupid deck, discard your hand. Great, you killed me on turn 1. Real interesting. But that's not where you get your points playing Dredge. It's about knowing how to play these bizarro games and like slowly grinding your opponent with Icarids and shifting and having the right sideboard cards and building your deck properly, even down to like, oh, how many Dread Returns am I playing? Do I have these targets for this week? All of that stuff matters. And by gaining mastery of an archetype that's thought of as a little simple, a little like boring, you actually unlock all of this interesting stuff for yourself.
So Adam Prozac said it best, where he described Dredge as a beatdown deck that draws 7 cards per turn.
That tracks. Yeah. It's not what people think it is in most instances.
Yeah. And I mean, you and I are Dredge bros. We played Legacy Dredge, I think maybe in like different periods kind of, but ultimately it's the same thing where, yeah, you got to get scrappy with that Putridum sometimes, man. You know, you gotta like discard some gas to make that thing a 2/2 flyer. You have to hard cast Icarid sometimes, you do what you got to do.
Yeah. And like strange combat decisions came up all the time and
bridge
all
triggers.
Dredge triggers. Yeah, that was probably my worst part when it came to Dredge. I think I'm on camera forgetting quite a few of them.
Oh, no, bridge. Like knowing like when to attack and block and like whether or not to like hold your bridge or like discard it because you knew that a trade was going to happen, stuff like that.
Yep, all that stuff comes up over and over. And
it's
the more you play, the more it gets unlocked.
Right. Exactly. And the cycling deck feels pretty similarly to that. Maybe not as complicated, but certainly in the planning as far as like what your actual game plan is the hardest thing.
Yep.
So I'm interested in that. I don't know if it's like super, super good right now. And Elrond's Epiphany does look nice, and Teamer has the Adventures package. You have, good interaction basically across the board. Your card power level is just off the charts too. So it's like, I mean, this deck looks pretty nice, but the cycling deck, it's like if you master it, you will be rewarded, I think.
I think you're right.
So I don't know. I actually don't want it to pick up in popularity, but I think that
you don't want to play against it all the time.
Well, like that, and I don't want people to like sideboard against it. And yeah, I think that there are a lot of complaints that people could make when playing against the deck where it's like, well, I kept a hand that was good against like this game plan, but then I lost a fox. So the next game I like mulled to a shock and then they didn't have a fox and I just lost their alliance. And, there's stuff like that where it's like, it's not really good for Magic for a deck to have like 4 different game plans. It's like, Cawblade where you have Stoneforge Jace and Wrath of God and counterspells.
Yeah, but dude, that's every deck now. That's like my go-to complaint about Magic as it stands is that every deck has multiple game. Like look at the Naya deck that we're talking about and how many ways that can theoretically win the game. It can beat you down or it can draw its literal entire deck, or maybe it'll combo you. Whatever it feels like in that moment, it has access to. And that's been what feels like every deck for a while now is they can just all do everything.
That is true, but Naya has issues, right? Because you are in Naya colors, they can't stop an ultimatum or an epiphany.
Sure.
So they are still kind of pigeonholed into beating you down at some point.
At some point. Yeah. So maybe the teamer version of Adventures is a little bit clearer representation of that idea, where it can counter spells, it has time walks, it can beat you down, it has great henge, and it just does all these things very well.
Yep. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've won a bunch of like pretty ridiculously bad looking games with teamer.
Yeah, that's always a good feeling.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's like, well, my opponent didn't play around me having Borrower into top deck Epiphany or something, but it happens. And decks like Naya don't really have that capability, right? If you like grind them down to 0, like they have 0. That's just where they're at.
I think the rebuild potential is good, but yes, for sure.
I'm thinking like no hand, no board. Pretty much, or like no board, one card end.
Every time I do that, it's like the last card is Edgewall Innkeeper, and then like the top 3 cards of their deck are adventures, and I don't know. Maybe I'm just cursed.
Yeah, no, you're definitely cursed. It's that's like okay. Reverse Collecting Company.
Right.
Well, what else? Was there anything else that you actually liked from these tournaments?
I thought Nassif's deck was interesting. He played 4-color Doom Foretold and brought
him and Manguchi have a problem, man. They are addicted to that.
They probably play too much Doom Foretold, yes. But I thought Nassif made some interesting decisions. One of the things I really loved was like a hard focus on Lithoform Blight. And I think like obviously Lithoform Blight is not to bear the brunt of this, but look at how the mono white, mono red aggro decks did in this tournament. They did terribly. Mono white aggro, 40% win rate, mono red aggro, 31% win rate. And, we had talked a lot about Faceless Haven being the most important card in Standard. That was absolutely true until people paid enough attention to it. And I think they did this week, and the answers started to pile up, and those decks really got punished. So part of it was like Lithoform Blight from Nassif, but also he gave up on the Doom Foretolds, at least in some part. There was 1 in the main deck, 3 in the sideboard, and I thought that was a really interesting decision and a really interesting place for the metagame to end up. So I agree with you. I think they are both often handicapping themselves by going to this deck time after time, but I do get the appeal. It does a lot of things that other decks aren't always prepared for, and it has a lot of tools. You can find a lot of answers to everything, but I do think it's operating on a slightly lower power level than the rest of the format.
It's lower power level, and you don't have like the I win button at 7 mana like a lot of these other decks do.
Yeah,
which means that
you can have it at 8 mana if you want to go with Dance, but it's not on the spot. You do need to untap with it. So
right, and Dance is also just one of those cards that is really bad against the sideboard counter spells, and
yes, very vulnerable.
Even like graveyard hate stuff. It's like if you want to play, I think it's the Abzan Ultimatum, the one that rebuys all the cards in your graveyard, which Nassif has done. Like he has played that card before. It's like, okay, sure, I could see that, but even then, that's not really like a turn 7 thing. That's like a turn 10 thing. I don't know. I don't like doing stuff like that, like trying to control what your opponent's doing when you can try to just slow them down and then play an I win card.
Well, so here's the other thing that Nassif did, and it doesn't go quite to the level of I win card, but this was very influential to me in what I worked on this week. Also played 4 Archon of Sun's Grace, which is somewhat of an I win button in these setups because you can play it alongside Urian and you just like get a huge army out of nowhere, and then it only takes 1 attack. So there's a bit of that going on. I don't think it's as far as, a combo kill or Alvarin's Epiphany, but it's at least acknowledging, yes, I do need to close these games. But what it led me to do is build blue-white control with Alvarin's Epiphany and this card and try and find setups where I could just like maximize, make a really devastating board and leverage the power of Alvarin's Epiphany and Sagas together and use that to control my opponent's battlefield. And it came up with a really satisfying, nice deck that I think, like, again, I am conceding that all of these decks are operating on a level that is just worse than adventure stuff. And that's going to be the case as long as Edgewall Innkeeper is around. But if you can find other reasons in the metagame to play them, I don't think they don't have their moments. You just have to pick them really, really carefully. So I think Nassif made the right moves for this week for this deck. And I think Nassif himself did fairly well. And a lot of that boils down to card choice. And I just think it's worth highlighting when you can find ways to make an archetype work. At the same time saying, though, you made yourself play on hard mode by making this archetype work in the first place.
Yeah, so I like Blight and Archon as answers to aggro. I think that is really good and really smart. And if you're kind of making a hard read on the metagame, cool. But there are a decent amount of like landmines in the tournament where it's like, oh yeah, my deck is not very good against this, right?
Right.
And maybe that doesn't matter if you're just like going 9-3 every weekend or whatever, 8-3.
Well, that's what we talked about, right? There's incentives to just be like pretty average and do okay. Yeah. And I don't know how much that factors into someone like Nassif's decision-making when it comes time for the tournament. How much would it have factored into your, like you're supposed to be playing these tournaments right now. How much would you be considering that?
I don't know. I mean, it's so far removed for me because I if I were in the middle of it, it's like I would know the players a little bit better, like their deck choices, their history a little bit better. And what I would do is like look at what I expected the metagame to be and was like, okay, is this exploitable for me to play some really weird deck? And if it's not, then it's like, okay, then I just have to play a good deck and like tune it to beat other things.
Right.
And yeah, maybe Nassif looked at it and he's just like, yeah, I mean, Paula's going to play aggro and like all these other good players are going to play aggro. And if they don't play like mono red or mono white, they're probably going to play adventures. So I'm going to be good against that. Like Sultai sucks, Rogue sucks. No one's going to play cycling, etc. You know, if he thought all of that, then yeah, his deck looks good.
Yeah, I will say I don't often try to argue that I'm on this level of caliber of player, but when I was playing against these players a bunch for like the Fandom Legends tournaments week in and week out, I did find their deck selection to be somewhat predictable. And maybe part of that is just like lower stakes or, you know, quality of competition. So you believe you can get away with it and just like play the best deck. But it was basically exactly that process that I would go through every week. Like, can I exploit these people who I expect to do this, this, and this? And oftentimes it led me to some decks that were like clearly not the best deck, but what I thought were best decks for the tournament. And then it paid off. Sometimes I just played the best deck. Sometimes I would play Scapeshift or something like that. And that would do the job as well. But occasionally I felt like there was an edge to be gained in this type of deck selection. And that goes back to like the Naya deck that we started this podcast with. Did it have a hold to Sultai? Almost definitely. But could you make a very good read that a lot of this field would abandon Sultai? I think so.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I don't even know like what the numbers are specifically for Fury against Sultai because in theory, you know, they tap out to sweep you and then you get to combo kill them potentially. Mm-hmm. So you always have that out. But I also don't really want to draw Unleash Fury against a deck with a bunch of spot removals. So
yeah, a lot of blanks.
I don't know exactly what what people's plan is in that matchup from the Naya side. But yeah, it is interesting where if you just assume that no one is going to play Sultai anymore, but it's like that's just dangerous, you know? Like there are going to be people who are working on the deck, and the deck ultimately is, you know, like this ramp deck with a bunch of spot removal. And it's like, you can figure out ways to make that good against aggro. Like if the reason that Sultai is bad is that there's a bunch of aggro decks, it's like, well, make your deck better against aggro. You know, what are you doing? You don't have to prepare for like mirrors anymore. You don't have to play the main deck negates and mystical disputes and all that nonsense. Like just make your deck as good against aggro as possible. And that let your natural top end just kind of smash everyone else. And that's what Zivka's deck did.
Yeah, if there's one thing that the Sultai archetype, broadly speaking, has proven it can do, it's adapt and alter itself to be good against different metagames, prepare for mirrors, prepare for aggro. It almost always has the tools to do so because its core is so robust. And granted, it's lost a lot of that. Like losing Uro is certainly a huge knock, but there's still the core of like ramp powerful spells going on. Do you want to talk a little bit about how they built the Sultai deck? Anything you found particularly interesting?
So I was kind of in the same boat as you where I was trying to do Toski Epiphany stuff. And once I started tuning Teamer without Obosh, Toski was one of the cards that I wanted to put in my deck, and then I played some games against Sultai, and the Asika's Chariot, they have 3 chariots in their deck, and just like, it doesn't brick Toski completely because, you know, you still have flyers, you have other tokens, whatever, but when Toski itself is not a threat, it's so much worse, right?
True.
So the chariot against like my random Toski thing, it was like, okay, yeah, this is like actually good. It's like an extinction event without being an actual sweeper and can actually clock people and close games really quickly with the Kraken tokens and stuff like that. So it's like that's one of the things where it's like that's a really good innovation that I think goes a long way to helping the aggro matchups.
Yeah, really cool pickup. And it also, like, the recurring theme of find ways to close games. Asika's Chariot certainly does that. It can close things down very quickly. So,
yeah, I don't know if this is meant to be there for that, but they have one duress main deck, and having one duress that you can ultimatum for in mirror matches, like if you get to ultimatum first, right? Like, what do you get? You know, you get like Vorinclex, Valky, and Time Walk, and then they get rid of your Time Walk, and you have these two things that they could just like untap and kill, right?
yeah.
Or just like ultimatum you back. And the duress means that if you get duress and Time Walk, you're either going to get another turn or like maybe duress their ultimatum and get something else. So it's like, I don't know if it was meant for exactly that, but now having seen that, I don't think that I could play this deck without one duress main.
That's interesting. That's a good point too, is like, these things that appear to be small adaptations that could actually be tremendous, right? Because you gain access to them pretty reliably via Emergent Ultimatum, and they can change entire game plans. Like you just mentioned, you have an entirely new way of approaching the mirror match. So that's really cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, mostly the deck is like kind of the same. Like there's a couple mystical disputes to kind of hedge. They have 2 Tangle Florahedrons to make you a little bit more rampy, give you more things to do on turn 2 against aggro decks, which is nice. Seagate Restoration to beat other Urian decks going long, which they probably need once they're skewing themselves a little harder towards aggro.
Yep.
So like all of this stuff just like looks really good. Like this list looks nice outside of the sideboard because, you know, they over prepped for mirrors, I think.
Sure.
But I mean, they had a list. They're like, oh yeah, this deck has problems. We can solve it. It stands to reason that other teams would maybe think the same thing, whatever. So I don't know. Brad wrote his article this week on the deck and talked about like the genesis of it and stuff like that, and talked about the sideboard and changes that he would make going forward. So check that out if you want to get back on the Sultai train. Not you, Brian, because you should not play Sultai.
Yeah, I don't want to. So, so that's fine. Not going to be an issue.
Good,
I would
great.
rather keep having decent win rates with my weird decks. I don't really feel any draw to this Sultai list, so that's fine.
Cool. Yeah, man, that's it. I think it's just like Chariot, really. It's the thing that gives you a lot of percentage against aggro without being just like a dead spot removal spell in some matchups, you know?
Yeah, just going back to good old blocking and attacking. You love to see it. Classic Magic.
Yeah, sort of. It's more like deter you from attacking. That's like classic Magic.
So a stasis is what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah.
Asika's Chariot actually Winter Orb.
Yeah. Well, Winter Orb, you could still attack, right? So.
Or it'd be Tangle Wire would be like the closest analogy, right?
I think Stasis is good. Stasis is nice.
Okay. You a Stasis player back in the day?
I was an admirer from afar.
Okay.
I lost to Stasis in a Grand Prix too, which pissed me off because like I had played with Stasis, not in tournaments, but like I understood how the deck worked and like I still just blew it.
I loved playing Stasis decks. I'm a horrible human at my heart. I think it makes me feel very bad, but Stasis, Winter Orb, all that stuff just worked for me for some reason.
Yeah. I like Stasis in theory, but then like you play the games and it's like, oh, this is really boring. Like you're not doing anything, right? And correct. I want, when I'm like grinding my opponent into dust or like, you know, making it so they can't play Magic, I want to actually have to work for it than just like, I'll play an island every turn, whatever. It was just not appealing to me.
Here's the conclusion I come to on that and why I liked it and why like I still like the idea of Stasis decks. And I wouldn't argue that they should be included in the game again, but here's why when something Stasis-esque happens, at least in the short term, I think it's net positive. One of the things about Magic is that its rules like are pretty clearly designed to set up a certain set of scenarios, right? Like you're supposed to be entering combat, attacking, blocking, progressing through the game and accumulating mana and casting larger spells. And there's a natural script that's supposed to be followed when it comes to a game. And the best games insist upon those scripts and then let you shatter them. And if Magic, when I started playing it, was just about creatures and attacking and blocking, I don't think it would have captured me the way it did. Like the fact that something like Stasis existed and something like Necropotence decks, which were very, very odd. And granted, they became like more traditional over time, but the early versions were like very resource denial heavy with like Hypnotic Spectre, Dark Ritual,
yeah, dude,
Neverneural's Disc. And if that stuff,
inject that directly into my veins.
Right. If that stuff didn't exist, I wouldn't have found the same draw to Magic. And that's why when I started teaching my wife this past year, we started with Pioneer, and like I built Lotus Field combo and I showed her Lotus Field combo. And it's like kind of stupid in one sense because there's me, she's only getting comfortable with the game and there's me on the other side of the table just comboing off relentlessly and killing her on turn 4. But like, I think you need to see that. I think you need to see what's possible because that's what ignites your creative spark. Yeah,
man. I've said this a lot with like the beginner packs that they give people where it's like, well, this one has like a Shivan Dragon and this one has a Thorn Elemental or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think that's it.
Yeah, those are cool, right? But that's like, oh, okay, yeah, this thing is sweet, like on to the next one. But it's not the thing that actually hooks them.
Yeah, put a Splinter Twin in there. Like I know that sounds crazy, but like the possibility of putting together some infinite combo, and it should probably be more complicated than just like Splinter Twin on my Deceiver Exarch, but like something along those lines, make it a Village Bellringer or something really inefficient. And I think if you show them that spark, that's what could really get them hooked for the long term.
Right. Yeah. I remember, seeing like halves of combos, right? And I'm just like, oh, well, that card sucks. And then I find the other half, 6 months later or whatever. I'm like, wait a second, right? And it's like, holy shit.
Yeah, more like Lure Regeneration on my Thicket Basilisk. That was good as a starting player for Magic. And I am sounding like a total boomer now, so I'll shut up. People listening to this podcast are like, what are these cards? I've never heard of this in my life.
Yeah, that's fine though. Yeah, for you playing Stasis, I can just imagine you like reveling in the fact that you don't have to do anything and you just, really corny, over the top, super villain, maniacal laugh, like upkeep my Stasis, play my land, your turn, ha ha ha. Keep
in mind that the vast majority of the Magic games I played as a younger person were against my little brother. So when you add the dynamics,
you just want to torture him.
Oh, absolutely. When you add the dynamics of being able to just beat up your little brother relentlessly, it really amplifies the need for griefing.
What's the age difference between you and your brother?
He is 6 years younger than me.
Okay. No, that's wild. So my younger brother is also 6 years younger than me, but like I basically like pieced out when I guess I was 21.
Okay.
So I don't know. At that point, it was like, I'm kind of like an adult and he's still a child, and like beating up on him did not give me like that satisfaction or whatever. But
yeah.
My older brother was 2 years older than me. And so like we had that going on because we were like close enough in age. And it was like, the game is not fun unless one of us just like wants to never play the game again.
Correct. And it was always my brother who never wanted to play the game again because the difference was so large. But I think our circumstances were unique too, in that we grew up super isolated. Like we lived in the forest in the middle of nowhere, where our closest neighbor was like our grandmother a mile down the road. So it wasn't like you go hang out with the other kids, or like our parents were dropping us off at friend's house. We were just with each other, and there wasn't any other option but do things together or do things by yourself. That was it. And so he had to pick up a lot of my hobbies, I think, by virtue of me being the older brother, but like still did a good job. Like at the time I found Magic, I would have been probably 12. So he's a 6-year-old kid who had to learn Magic and was like functional, at least understood the rules of the game and was able to play. So I think like he benefited from it, but probably I'm being a little kind to my interpretation of what I forced him to go through when he was younger.
Likely. I mean, I remember some experiences with my little brother where it's like, we play Pokemon together, and that was like my secret way of like trying to get him into Magic, basically. It was like, oh, I'll play this Pokemon game with you. Yeah, sure. And then we can try the big boy card game after that. I don't know, man. Yeah, it was just like, it was so far removed as far as like, the things that we were able to comprehend. And I had a friend who's also like very good at Magic. So I was like pretty caught up on magic and strategy and stuff like that versus
Right.
my little brother who like, we didn't have the internet or whatever, so he was screwed.
Right.
So it felt kind of mean.
Yeah, maybe you're just a better person than I am. I just reveled in it, and that it still informs a lot of the dynamic between my brother and I. Like it still is very much the core of competition, and me savagely beating him, and then forcing him to learn something new, and then savagely beating him at it. And I don't know. I hope one day he just finds something where he can just school me repeatedly before we pass on from this mortal plane. He finds his one thing that he gets to just dominate me at, because he hasn't found it yet.
Well, how is your brother as far as like, competitiveness or whatever? Because my little brother, like he wanted to like play the games and stuff, and he certainly wanted to win. But like, if I just destroyed him in a game, he wouldn't be like, okay, how do I get better at this so I can put up more of a fight or whatever. He would just be like, okay, maybe this is not for me, and he would just give it up.
It's strange because my brother has some of that for sure, where like he doesn't necessarily have the same drive I do, where, I mean, that's why I ultimately beat him at everything, right? So if I lost, I would go absolutely apocalyptic and just study until I wasn't losing anymore. And he doesn't really have that, but at the same time, he really wants to win. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds, where he really is invested in the outcome, but not willing to put in the work to get to the point where his outcomes are routinely good. But I mean, he plays a ton of Magic. He plays the challenges every weekend. He's definitely in them. So if you're one of the Magic Online people, you've certainly played against him a bunch on there.
So your brother's a bot.
Yeah, he's a bot. He top 8'd the Pioneer Challenge last weekend, and he's got like, he lost in a PTQ finals before and has an SCG top 4. So it's not like he's clueless. He can certainly play his way around the Magic field. But
now I want to go look at the Pioneer Challenges, and by that I mean I am looking at the Pioneer Challenges, and I want to critique your brother's deck building.
Oh, he just copied it from someone else. I wouldn't really. I think he actually played the list that won the challenge the day before. It's just Rakdos Croxa.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, but it's a strange dichotomy of both really wanting to win but not wanting to do any work to actually guarantee those wins.
Yeah, so that reaction where you lose, and you described it as apocalyptic, that was me after every Magic tournament when I was a kid.
Yeah, oh, same. Every Little League game, I was a disaster, and I am embarrassed about it in retrospect.
I just mean like, it just like really fires you up and gives you that drive, and you're just like, all right, how do I need to like study and train to get better so that I don't lose again?
But did you handle it well on top of that? Because I certainly had that, but I also didn't handle it well.
I think that I did until I got pretty good. And then I was, so like if I'm bad and I lose, I know it's because I'm bad. So I have no right or reason to get upset at that. It's like, I probably blew it, or I'm realizing like how my deck was bad or whatever. And I'm just like, okay, I need to fix these things. But then like once I got good and I would lose these people who like I could tell were not very good. And, me just being like an angry kid and whatever, like all of this stuff, I was like very mean to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it was nothing to do with like what they did. I was probably in the same situation, honestly, where it's like I blew it, which is why I lost. And instead of like, I would also like, double down and like go do the training and get better and stuff like that. I always had that because I wanted to avoid that feeling of losing. And I knew that there was more to learn and stuff like that. But like in the moment, I was just like, I want to make this person feel as bad as possible.
Yeah, it's a weird response. And I think like a huge part of my maturation process was working that out. And I don't know, like, I don't know. I'm not having kids, so I guess this isn't something I actually have to worry about. But the idea of teaching a kid to lose well is so valuable. And I don't know the best way to do that. But if I were a parent, that would be one of the things that I would absolutely emphasize, is just like, how do you grow from adversity, and how do you not take it personal, and how do you see that like people will be better than you at things, and it's not a knock on you. It's a chance to explore your potential and see how good you can be when you lose, not just the absolute indictment of who you are as a person. And that's the way I took it, because I had such like a high opinion of myself at that point that there's no possible way someone could be better than me at this thing. But of course, everyone was better than me at most things. Like it's just nonsense. And you have to learn how to see yourself as you actually are and accept who you actually are.
Yeah. And I think I did that. Like I definitely knew my limitations and was pretty realistic about them, but I was also just like mean to other people because it made me feel slightly better. So I was a shitty kid for sure. But as far as like teaching your kids, it's like I at this point, I don't think that I'm going to have kids either, but I would be interested in like trying those sorts of things to see if I could figure out how to actually teach them. But it's like, it doesn't need to be my actual kid to do that,
That's true. That's a good way of looking at it.
But it seems so hard, right? Because like you're talking about like an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old. Like there's no even like 25-year-olds, right? Like there's no good age for you to be like, hey, you lost because you blew it, and that's okay. It just means that like this is point that you can learn from and get better, right? And like no one takes that positively. There are just so few people who are like, oh yeah, you're right. That's cool. I definitely recognize my inadequacies and that's okay. It's just like, it's not the world we live in.
Yeah, very true. And I don't know how to make it the world we live in. And I don't know if it should be the world. Like there's certainly challenges with fostering competitive fire under like, you can't always be the best, because then you can just say, well, I didn't win. Okay. Like you need a mix of both, right? If you're going to be a great competitor, like you need to find that fire within you, and you need to still not let it overcome you. And I'm sure the emotional regulation it takes to do so is just beyond most youths. Although I say that, and like I'm thinking of young Magic players I know now who are just like very grounded, very balanced people. And maybe I'm just a crappy person and it has nothing to do with age, and because there's so many like great kids in Magic right now who are just really not only good Magic players but good people on top of it, and I'm always impressed when I interact with them.
Yeah, there were a lot of kids I knew when I was, I don't know, maybe like 20 or something, and like John Panic was one, Jesse River was another, who's like a very good Magic player that I guarantee no one has ever heard of, where I was just like blown away being like, 2 to 5 years their senior or whatever. And just having them have the positive response without the negative and at such a young age. Mm-hmm. It was immediately like what made me want to be friends with those people. Cause it was just like, yeah, they just have like all of the good and none of the bad.
Yeah. When I think of something like that, the person who springs to mind for me is like, MTG Milan over on Twitter. Go follow MTG Milan. Awesome kid.
Yeah.
Just like a great, smart kid, already incredible at Magic, going to do amazing things if that's what he wants to do. And just like so grounded and aware of everything it's going to take to be a really great Magic player. And it's just impressive to see someone with that kind of composure at a young age.
Yeah, he reminds me a lot of those kids too. And he's another one of those people where I was just like, yeah, I definitely want to like, hang out with this kid, get to know him, because he's got it, he's going to be able to figure out how to be successful in whatever he does, which is really awesome.
Yep. It's always great to see that.
Yeah. It's wild. I think the stages I went through were just like, I'm really bad at this. So if I complain, I'm just going to get made fun of. Right. Because then they can just bring up how bad I am. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to feel stupid. So I just don't do that. I just put my head down and I lose, and that's it. And then I get to the point where I'm good and I lose. And then I would go tell my friends that I like mulled to 4 or something. And it's like, maybe I did mull to 4 in game 3, but I also blew game 2. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
half
like
the story.
Yeah. You like lie by omission. And then I think when I was like doing well and in a good mood and kind of like got what was going on, I didn't have any of those stories to tell really. So I would like tell stories where it's like, yeah, my opponent like did this and then this and then this, and I had multiplied that game and I won, and it was like, those were the stories I was telling. And I was like, no matter
the swerve ending.
Yeah. Except after like a year of it, it wasn't a swerve anymore. Everyone
just expected it. Yeah.
Yeah. I I think like the first time that Tim Ayton was just like, I started with like, oh, I mulled to 5 and missed my third land drop. And Tim's like, yeah, you won. I got it. And I'm just like, okay, I'm going to stop telling you these stories, Tim.
Yeah, you've taken the fun away.
Yep. And I wondered, like, at what point he got sick of it before he finally said something, right? But and then after that, there was like the brief period where it was like cool for people to be like owning up to their mistakes. Like that was very in vogue.
Yeah, I think I like that mode better as a default. Obviously, like you want both in balance, but I'll always take the default mode of like, I made this mistake.
Yeah, but it's still another one of those things where it's like you're talking to your friends in between rounds and it's like, I just want to know your record, not your life story. Right?
Or maybe I just want to know your life story and I don't care about your record. Also a very strong possibility.
Yeah, either or. But instead they just want to tell me about how, this very convoluted game state led to them getting a bad read and they made an attack and their opponent had it or whatever. And it's like, yeah, you blew it. But like, you realize you blew it. You don't really need to tell me. Like, I don't really care. I can't do anything about it. You realize where you messed up. I can't give you advice. I'm just like, yeah, sounds like you blew it. Like, okay, good talk.
Yeah, no notes.
So it's like that part is not bad, right? It's certainly way less toxic than like any of the other eras. But yeah, it is very strange. I do want to, I guess, like normalize more of that without like, the boring story or just like the seeking validation. Like, yeah, you blew it, but it'll be okay, champ. You'll get him the next one, like pat on the head, whatever.
Make this your goal when we return to live Magic. This conversation is making me miss going to a Magic tournament. By
Dude,
the way. I'm having like the surrounding emotions that come from like walking around a convention center right now.
I did this for like 5 years straight, and I don't know if it had any effect on anyone, but like, I walk up to people. This happened more at like GPs than anything because they were so big, right? It's like round 7 and you see someone that you didn't even know was there and you go up to them and you say like, hey man, how have you been or whatever. And they're like, oh, I'm 5-2. And I'm just like, I don't care about your record. I was asking about you.
Right.
And I honestly want to normalize. What I really want to normalize is actual human interaction and not talking about Magic. That's what you should do during Magic tournaments.
Never mention Magic under any circumstances.
Seriously, do not mention your record ever. Ever.
I don't think it's going to get taken that far, but I understand what you're going for. And
then, because at the end of the day, like say you've been like, scrapping out at X and 5, and then they announce the top 8. And you're like, oh, my friend's in the top 8. I've been talking to them all day and I just didn't even know. Happy surprise. Boom.
Yeah. I've had that happen. I don't remember who it was exactly, but I just be like, oh, that person's been doing well this whole time.
Yeah. I've had that
happen.
Nice. I've had that happen a couple times too. And I'm just like, damn, that is rad that they made top 8 and also that they did not feel the need to, brag to me about how they're 13-0 or whatever.
Yep. Yeah. Good focus.
Yep.
Game.
Good luck.